There's an operating assumption in mainstream media that basically young conservative evangelicals don't exist. Today, I want to sort of engage three myths which I believe allow for the perpetuation of this false notion. A recent article in The New Yorker by Eliza Griswold titled "Millennial Evangelicals Diverge from Their Parents' Beliefs" claims that younger evangelicals are trending politically to the left and that their doing so accurately represents the views of the Bible. And there are at least, but we're going to deal with, three claims that she makes in this article which are demonstrably untrue. The first myth is that most millennial evangelicals are liberals or leftists, okay? So Griswold, the author of this New Yorker article, she casts all young evangelicals as left-leaning political activists, essentially. So she cites Ed Stetzer, the executive director of the Billy Graham Center at Wheaton College in Illinois, who says this. Ed Stetzer says that, quote, "Younger evangelicals are not as ready to jump into patriotism. They love their country, they love their faith, they just don't want those things inappropriately mixed," end quote. Griswold, she writes that the ethnic diversification of evangelicalism is part of what's really resulted in younger evangelicals speaking out on issues like family separation at the border, climate change, police brutality, immigration reform, stuff like that. But this association between the younger generation and a leftist perspective, it simply isn't supported by the sociological data, nor is it necessarily supported that this younger data is not wanting politics and faith intermingled, as Stetzer suggests. I actually don't think that that's the case at all, okay? With all due respect to Ed Stetzer. A poll of 65,000 voters conducted by Reuters found that millennials have become much more conservative from 2016 to 2018. The Democrats losing a 14-point lead to Republicans in that time, and Republicans have taken an even greater lead since the Kavanaugh hearing, which sociologists are calling the Kavanaugh effect because it really unveiled the hysteria caused and required by the left. So another study published in a journal called Personality and Social Psychology Bulletin analyzed 3 nationally representative surveys of U.S. residents, so kind of like a meta-analysis. But what makes it so valuable is that this study, totaling 10 million people, found that millennials are not less conservative than Gen Xers or Boomers, but they rather have, millennials are more politically polarized. So they're, among millennials, more identify with radical left or right than do among Gen Xers or Boomers, but the ratio hasn't really changed that much. A third study in the Oxford Journal called Politics analyzed the data of the USCID 2006 survey and the European Social Survey, and it combined its analysis of those, and it suggests that racial minorities are, in the United States, less active in politics, and whites are more likely to protest social issues. In other words, the growth of the social justice movement is more attributable to the extremation of white liberals than the diversification of a group, which is what Griswold originally suggests. So I'm sorry for that sort of data dump that we had to do there, but this should be applied to understanding evangelicals as well. This gives us a lay of the land sociologically. It debunks some of these common myths floating around there that, well, everybody's, especially among young people, it's all trending left, the next generation is going to be left, and they're more diverse, and anybody who has diverse ethnicity, well, of course, they're going to be left-leaning, right? Sort of these racist assumptions about how other ethnicities are going to side one way or the other, right? So this kind of gets to the heart of Griswold's error. And the error may have been that her sampling size, in her words, included hipster evangelicals who were, quote, clad in black t-shirts with white crosses, Vans, and jeans ripped out at the knees, end quote. What would she have found? What would Griswold have found about young evangelicals? What would she have found if instead of visiting the Block Church in downtown Philadelphia, she visited the chapel at Carlisle Military Base Chapel and surveyed the religious practices and political views of the millennials there? What would she do if she surveyed millennials who wore blue blazers and pleated khakis to church? Okay, so she's doing her survey and her interviews and her sociological research based on an urban evangelical church that attracts people who generally don't dress like conservatives. The point here is simple. There's a growing conservative movement among young Americans All of the legitimate data that's being published and the most recent data that's being published bears this out and ratifies this conclusion, right? The conservative base is growing among young people in general and among young evangelicals in particular. Young evangelicals are becoming more conservative as well. And Griswold's article ignores that fact and perpetuates this myth that most young evangelicals are leftists or liberals. They're not. Okay, and this article, Griswold, she proceeds on assumptions about the sociological activity of these groups, evangelicals and millennials, evangelical millennials in particular, that are demonstrably in error when you line it up against the most recent sociological data from Reuters, from the journal Personality and Social Psychology Bulletin, and from this recent study published in the Oxford journal Politics, which surveys the most recent USCID data from 2006 and the European Social Survey. Okay, her operating assumptions about how young evangelicals are trending left is simply false. And young Americans, and that assumption, if it were to be made about young Americans in general, would also be false. Okay. Myth number two. Myth number two is that Jesus was himself a leftist. Okay. So Griswold writes this, quote, "These younger believers focus more on the example of Jesus's life in the Gospels. Jesus practiced a radical love," one man told her, while sitting on a stoop. She said, or this guy named Cologne the Boy, he said this, quote, speaking about Jesus, quote, "This dude was breaking down gender roles and taking on racial issues that made people around him hate him," end quote. Okay, this article makes it sound, okay, anybody who's been to Bible college or seminary has met this guy freshman year, and usually that guy, after studying theology or biblical studies, does not maintain that opinion very long. Griswold, in quoting this random church attendee's opinions about Jesus, right? It makes it sound like the only reason that a Christian would be politically conservative is if he twisted scripture to fit his cultural preference and ignored important passages in the Bible, which actually secretly supported a leftist agenda, okay? Now, hermeneutics is a complicated process, and the process of translating what the text meant and what it means for us will create a diversity of views about how it should be applied, okay? So we should make a few points. First, in the Christian view, the life of Christ does not represent the sum total of God's revelation, okay? The Bible is God's revelation, which includes Old Testament, the Gospels, epistles, and apocalyptic literature. We must use these writings to interpret one another, okay? So while in one passage, Jesus may be deconstructing the culture, in others, he's setting up exclusive boundaries that most liberals today would call Islamophobic. Okay, so he says, "No one comes to the Father except through me," John 14:6. Doesn't really line up with the leftist agenda. God's going to send everyone to hell unless you believe in me. Wow. That doesn't sound very good. That doesn't sound very leftist at all, okay? Okay, second, moving from what the Bible meant to what it means for today is a complicated hermeneutical task. The fact that people hated Jesus, okay, and this does not translate into a Christian command. Go and make people hate thee, for I am the Christ. Okay, it's the culturally deconstructive acts of Jesus don't condone all cultural deconstruction everywhere, as this prophetic theologian sitting on the stoop of this downtown urban Philadelphia church tells us that it is, or tells Griswold that it is, okay? I don't even know why she's taking him as a theological authority. Why not interview young evangelical theologians? Why not? Millennials are actually teaching in seminaries now. Okay? Why are you finding this random homeless Christian on the side of the road? Okay? Okay, so the culturally deconstructive acts of Jesus don't condone all cultural deconstruction everywhere, as many postmodern, Christians would argue, okay? And that's actually a very old notion, dating back to John Caputo and theologians like him, okay? There is a reason that scholars have debated for millennia about the meaning of these texts, okay? It's easier to misconstrue the life of Christ and certain sort of proverbial sayings that he has for pacifist and Marxist and postmodern narrative agendas, because Jesus intentionally spoke a bit ambiguously and in parables, because his whole point was, he who has ears, let him hear. People who twist Jesus to ratify some political agenda, they're not doing it right. They don't have the ears to hear. They're not listening, okay? They're not listening to conform their lives to the teachings of Christ. They're looking to conform the teachings of Christ to their political agenda, okay? But it's not as easy to do that with the Apostle Paul, who writes in Romans 13, or the martial themes in the book of Revelation. Or it's not quite as easy to twist the whole of Scripture into a Marxist agenda. In fact, it's impossible. The problem is, in order that is the whole Christian doctrine of Revelation requires us to sort of take the canon as a whole. You can take one book in Scripture and draw some crazy heretical theology out of it. That's why all the early Christian heresies were rejected. They were cutting up Scripture. Marcionism rejected, most of Scripture except for like 10 books in Paul or something like that. There were tons of heresies in the early church that would have totally worked if you took one line or one book. But the problem is Christian orthodoxy is accountable to the entire canon of Scripture. And unless your political theory, if you're trying to justify it theologically, unless it can answer to the entire canon of Scripture, then it's less than biblical. Okay? It must answer to the whole thing to say, well, Jesus was deconstructing culture in his day, bro. Okay, fine. The ethical import of that and the political import of that is far from clear, and the way in which that functions within a canonical theology is even far less clear. Okay? And so the idea that this quote was used as a precedent for millennial evangelical opinion and as representative of that opinion, and even as representative of the future of Christian theology among young millennials, is simply absurd. It is simply absurd. It has such terrible and tragic implications for what used to be reputable journalistic sources like the New Yorker. It's absolutely terrible. So, third, and this has further import for the intended nature of biblical texts that can get sort of to the heart of the distinction between the Lutheran two-kingdom theology and the Calvinistic Kuyperian worldview theology. So, for example, if Jesus commands Christians to sell everything that they have and give it to the poor, does that entail that United States public policy should enforce the redistribution of American capital conceived through a Marxist lens? That is, that profit is theft? Okay, so the full texts of the original passage in Matthew 19 reads like this: "Go, sell what you possess and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven, and come and follow me." End quote. That's what Jesus says. So should the United States government compel following Jesus at gunpoint as well? Okay, so leftists want a Christian nation when Scripture can be construed to align with this Gramscian hostility towards economic and cultural disparity. All right, leftism only wants Jesus to the degree that he can be used to sway the Christian population towards a leftist agenda, towards socialism. And in this regard, nothing is new, and it's a clear twisting of the theological use of that biblical text. Fourth, Griswold makes it sound like leftism is the natural entailment of the gospel accounts of Jesus, and as if conservatism is just a self-serving misinterpretation, clearly rebuked by Scripture, and her only evidence being the genius hermeneutical insight of this 20-year-old college student outside a jazz club near the church. Unfortunately, for this view held by this brilliant 20-year-old hermeneutician, who I'm sure church fathers for ages to come will look back upon and praise, okay, unfortunately for this view, the same Jesus who transgressed Pharisaical cultural norms also spoke about what economists call the Matthew principle, which is a capitalist concept, which says, "For to everyone who has will more be given, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who has not, even that he has will be taken away." Matthew 25. So, first common myth: most evangelical millennials are leftists. Wrong. Second, Jesus was a leftist, biblically falsified. Third, the third myth is that Roe v. Wade is commonly supported among evangelicals. I don't even know how she gets away with it. So one hint that Griswold is writing from a leftist perspective is that she lumps in Roe v. Wade with other social justice concerns without blinking an eye. Okay? And her evidence that evangelicals may be reconsidering Roe is the view of Jonathan Merritt, who is a Christian, sort of quasi-Christian writer, and Merritt says this. He says, "I'm personally pro-life, but would I pull a lever and overturn Roe v. Wade? The answer is no." Okay, and so Griswold comments, quote, Merritt's view is common among his fellow believers, that abortion is wrong and there are ways to work on reducing it without overturning the law of the land, end quote. False. Okay, this is false. This is not a common view among evangelicals. It's just not. Okay, and we're going to get to the moral logic of this view in a second, but it is not a common view among evangelicals that they're pro-life, but hey, it's the law of the land. What are you going to do? No. Evangelicals do not believe this, okay? There's a recent Pew survey that shows that evangelicals, about whose views the article explicitly sets out to describe, Griswold explicitly sets out to describe the evangelical view in this New Yorker article, right? Evangelicals have the highest rate of any religious group for supporting the overturn of Roe at a rate of 63%, only after Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses, okay? And I don't understand the reasoning that Griswold says is common, okay? If you believe abortion is killing a baby in the womb, all right? And I don't mean to get all pro-life on you right now, but if you believe that abortion is killing a baby in the womb, and there was a single Supreme Court decision that permitted the states the liberty to perform this killing, why on God's green earth wouldn't you overturn that decision if it was as easy as pulling a lever? Okay, if you were alive in 1942, this would be a philosophically absurd claim. You know, I'm personally anti-Nazi, but would I pull a lever and end the Holocaust? The answer is no. Okay, first of all, you'd be a monster. Second of all, you'd be ethically culpable for millions of deaths. Luckily, you don't have that lever. If you had a cost-free preventative power to save millions of lives and chose not to do so, you would be culpable for gross negligence and worse. Okay, so the moral logic of Merritt's statement and the moral logic that Griswold seeks to legitimize and popularize among evangelicals or perpetuate the myth that it is popularized among evangelicals is a lie. It is flawed and devastating and absurd moral logic. Okay, so Griswold writes in her conclusion, quote, some, like Cologne LeBoy, who's the college student sitting outside the church that gave us the profound thoughts on Jesus, some, like Cologne LeBoy, are still uncertain about their views on repealing Roe. Surprise, surprise. Which might further disadvantage the Latino and African American communities, end quote. Again, how does taking away the ability to kill the babies in your community disadvantage your community? I don't get it. Okay, Griswold's treatment of Roe in this article is the golden thread of her leftist bias that explains how she can cast evangelicals and millennials and conservatism so reductively and inaccurately in such a short space. It is astonishing how wrong she gets every population she sets out to describe. It is ridiculous. It is, oh my God, and it is more than lamentable. It is mockable how wrong she gets millennials and evangelicals and conservatives. And we should also note that those who dismiss those who are enthused about abortion as one-issue voters clearly don't understand the pro-life position, okay? Try to understand it from the pro-life perspective. In that perspective, a fetus is a human life. Currently in the United States, it is legal to kill that human life. This means that we're practicing infanticide in the United States. There could not be a more heinous evil. Now, you can either disagree that the fetus is a human life, which because this becomes an easily falsifiable claim at both the scientific and philosophical level, or you can accept that the hysteria about Roe, in fact, isn't even as fervent as it ought to be. But this question of the humanity of the human fetus, it hangs over the question of abortion. It's not about women's rights, it's about infants' rights. And Christians who are on the pro-choice side of this debate theologically and politically are simply and unjustifiably wrong, and their moral reasoning is ridiculous, and it is the worst position of all the positions, and it is the most unjustifiable and indefensible position to say, I'm pro-life, but I wouldn't overturn this position if I could. Unjustifiable. Indefensible. So, while Griswold does cite several evangelical leaders who sort of identify more with the conservative policy wins as a motivator for the evangelical Trump vote, she contrasts these conservatives and she contrasts this policy concern with younger evangelicals like Cologne LeBoy, okay? And yet, an article on millennial evangelicals in the New Yorker ought to have been so much better. In fact, more than that, it just shouldn't have been so bad. It shouldn't have been so bad and so wrong and so inaccurate and so easily to falsify, statistically and factually falsified, like so many of her essential claims, okay? It ought to have taken into account the surging conservatism demonstrated in the Reuters poll before overstating the political homogeneity of millennials, which has been noted by many media outlets, including CNN and Time. And it played she just pretended like the conservative movement doesn't even exist. This article ought to have had a working knowledge of how minority and majority groups act politically before overstating the effect of ethnic diversification on the political concerns of evangelicals, okay? She overstated that far more than she should have, okay? So this piece is titled as a descriptive sociological report, okay? The title of this piece is Millennial Evangelicals Diverge from Their Parents' Belief. The notion that, well, parents are pro-Trump and millennials are, well, they're pro-Hillary or ... fill in the blank Democrat, right? So this piece is titled as a descriptive sociological report about the shifting political attitudes of young evangelicals, which, again, we falsified all the claims and all the presumptions that she doesn't even use data, but we falsified with data all the presumptions she uses to tell this story, okay? So this is titled as a descriptive sociological report, but it reads too much like an opinion piece to be taken seriously. This should have been posted, no. I was gonna say this should have been posted on a blog on the internet somewhere, but it should have been rejected by a blog on the internet somewhere, okay? I cannot believe the New Yorker published this piece. The problem is that this piece only tells half the story about a story about which it claims to tell the whole story. Millennial evangelicals aren't leftists, as Griswold suggests. Millennial evangelicals are just as politically polarized as the rest of American millennials. And this, everyone on Twitter already knows.